So you might want to mute yourself so that you don't pop up in the recording. And well, let's see how this goes. For some reason, Sandy is highlighted as the speaker, but you never know. In any case, I am so grateful for the opportunity to share this time with you as together we explore racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. This week, we are looking at part 4 of 6, mass incarceration and the war on drugs. As we've seen in the history described in these past 3 weeks, the relationship between African Americans and our country's justice systems, both the legal and the extra-legal versions, has been one of violence and oppression. We see the harbingers of what is to come in the system of convict leasing that followed the end of the Civil War, the echoes of lynching made manifest in today's uneven application of the death penalty, and the videos of unarmed Black men being killed by police bring home the continuing violence that stalks our land. The impunity with which these acts have been carried out echoes loudly in our current circumstances, although we are beginning to see glimmers of hope for more accountability, more justice. So today we will focus on the period following the landmark civil rights movement to observe what we have come to expect as the inevitable backlash against racial progress, and see how the combination of power and bigotry, the very definition of racism, shapes today's criminal justice system. So let's continue. A quick recap of our program last week. We looked at actions in the 20th century that began with housing segregation and the FHA, and the profound effects of those programs and that decision-making. We also then looked at discrimination in public policies such as Social Security and the GI Bill. Then the landmark Brown v. Board of Education decision by the Supreme Court and the massive resistance that it triggered, the legacy of which is visible everywhere in our country today. We considered some of the key events and the heroic actions of the leaders of the civil rights movement that led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There are 2 books that deal explicitly with the white backlash, if you will, of advances in rights and opportunities for Black people in our country. The first is White Rage by University of South Carolina professor Carol Anderson. And the more recent is a book called American Whitelash that sort of picks up at the end of the time period that Carol Johnson addressed. And it demonstrates that advances in rights for Black people inevitably triggers a pronounced, often violent backlash against that forward movement. So today we're going to turn our attention to the criminal justice system in the United States, and specifically the topic of mass incarceration. And I would propose that we have had 3 phases of mass incarceration in the United States. The first phase was slavery itself. The first laws passed that defined chattel slavery and the inheritability of that condition through the mother began in the colony of Massachusetts in 1640. And that phase, known as slavery, continued to the end of the Civil War in 1865. prior to the end of that war, however, what I would offer as phase 2 of mass incarceration was the system of convict leasing, where laws that specifically targeted Black individuals resulted in arrest and incarceration and hiring out these people to work in railroads, factories, agriculture, with the proceeds of their labor remitting to the states. And that process continued through 1928. You might consider there was a bit of a lapse in mass incarceration, but no reduction in the numbers of Black people incarcerated when phase 3 began with a vengeance in 1972. And so today we will look at mass incarceration and the war on drugs. The United States is home to less than 5% of the world's total population, and we have almost 25% of the world's inmates. In 1972, the United States had imprisoned 200,000 people. By 2017, that number had increased by an order of magnitude to 2.3 million people. And there are 7 million people under the control of the criminal justice system, if you will. Now, as a result of advocates and efforts to change laws in states, particularly, that 2.3 million number has reduced by 2023 to about 2 million. But still, we in the United States incarcerate a dramatically disproportionate number of our citizens. And in fact, mass incarceration emerged as a stunningly comprehensive and well-disguised system of racialized social control, strikingly similar to Jim Crow, a system of social control unparalleled in world history. No other country in the world imprisons so many of its racial or ethnic minorities. Imagine if Germany were to do the same with its Jewish population. People wouldn't stand for it. But incarceration rates in the United States, due to consequences of poverty, racial segregation, unequal educational opportunities, presumed realities of the drug market, plus. And so today, 7 million Americans are incarcerated or on parole or probation, and we will talk more about the specifics of those circumstances. And what we know from studies that have been done is that people of all colors use and sell drugs at remarkably similar rates. And yet, as we look at our prison population, there is a disproportionate impact on people of color. And what is telling about this is that given today's laws, even in the aftermath of the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it is legal to discriminate against criminals in all the ways that we used to discriminate against Black people. So while the Civil Rights Act says, nope, equal treatment is necessary, our laws in the criminal justice system mean that it is legal to discriminate against criminals in education, in housing, in jobs, in voting, in food stamps, in public benefits, and exclusion from jury service. So we have simply substituted one set of repressive discriminatory laws for another. So what do we know about the people who are incarcerated in the United States today? Now I want you, so there is a chart that shows racial disparities in prison incarceration rates as of 2019. Now this is state and federal prisons, so it does not include local jails. which also hold a significant number of people incarcerated. But for every 100,000 Black people, almost 1,100 are in prison. Of every 100,000 American Indian or Alaska Native, 547. Of Hispanics, 525. White people, 214. And Asians, 46. We know that Black people in the United States make up 13% of the general population, but they comprise 38% of the people in prison or jail. The percent of people serving life sentences or life without possibility of parole who are Black, 48%. The arrest rate for Black people in the United States for every 100,000 people is 6,109 arrests versus 2,795 for white people. And in 2018, 2.8 million Black people were arrested, and 30% of the people on probation and parole are Black. So the disproportionate rates of incarceration are apparent by the statistics everywhere. And I want you to pay really close attention to this next chart because there's going to be a test of the detail at the end. Okay, maybe not. So this is a chart showing where people are incarcerated in the United States. So of the approximately 1.9 million currently incarcerated, 1,047,000 are held in state prisons, 514,000 in local jails, and 209,000 in federal prisons and jails. If we look at the nature of the charges against these people, we find that 350,000 people are incarcerated due to drug offenses, 800,000 due to violent offenses. But it's important to recognize that in some states, Delaware included, many drug offenses are classified as violent crimes, even if no weapon or no violence actually occurred. And what is really stunning in looking at these numbers is that nearly 500,000 people, 490,000 people, are being held in state, local, and federal prisons awaiting trial. Not only have they not been found guilty, they haven't even had a trial. 500,000 people. So how did we get here? And what we know is that a major factor was the war on drugs, which we contend began in 1971 when President Nixon declared the war on drugs. Some years later, one of his primary aides, John Ehrlichman, was interviewed, and he said that Nixon considered that he had two main groups of enemies. For those of us alive during Nixon's presidency, we may remember the existence of the enemies lists. But John Ehrlichman said that Nixon saw two major groups of enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. And so as a consequence, he focused on the creation of drug laws that dealt with marijuana because of the anti-war left and heroin because of Black people. And in fact, his administration made marijuana a Schedule I drug alongside heroin and LSD. And imagine today, in many states, marijuana is legal. But this was the action taken. The Drug Enforcement Administration was created during his administration. And they dramatically increased the size and presence of federal drug control agencies, introduced the concept of mandatory sentencing, where the circumstances or the situation made no difference, and introduced no-knock warrants. And we will talk much more about that in a little bit. President Reagan extended the war on drugs. In 1981, Lee Atwater, who was a powerful Republican operative in politics, was recorded on tape. And given the nature of this evening's class group, I will use the words that he actually employed. He was recorded as saying, you start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. It hurts you. It backfires. So you say stuff like force busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract. Now, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this is much more abstract than the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, nigger. And so Lee Atwater served as a consultant to Ronald Reagan, whose race baiting continued when he moved to national politics. After he secured the Republican nomination in 1980, Reagan launched his official campaign at a county fair just outside Philadelphia, Mississippi. That was the town still notorious in the national imagination for the Klan lynching of civil rights volunteers James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner 16 years earlier. Reagan selected that location on the advice of a local official who had written to the Republican National Committee assuring them that the Neshoba County Fair was an ideal place for winning George Wallace-inclined voters. The candidate arrived to a raucous crowd of 10,000 whites chanting, "We want Reagan," and he returned their fevered embrace by assuring them, "I believe in states' rights." In 1984, he came back again, this time to endorse the neo-Confederate slogan, "The South shall rise again." Reagan also trumpeted his racial appeals in blasts against welfare cheats. On the stump, he repeatedly invoked the story of a Chicago welfare queen with, quote, 80 names, 30 addresses, 12 Social Security cards, collecting veterans' benefits on 4 non-existing deceased husbands. She's got Medicaid, getting food stamps. She's collecting welfare under each of her names. Her tax-free cash income is over $150,000. Often he placed this mythical welfare queen behind the wheel of a Cadillac, tooling around in flashy splendor. Beyond propagating the stereotypical image of a lazy, larcenous Black woman ripping off the system, he had another stereotype, and they were the workers, the taxpayers, the persons playing by the rules and struggling to make ends meet while brazen minorities partied with their hard-earned tax dollars. He talked about standing in line at the grocery store as the strapping young buck ahead of you bought T-bone steaks with his food stamps, while all you could afford was hamburger. So that avuncular symbol of inclusiveness and goodwill was one of the most overtly racist presidents we have had until recent times. And so he expanded the war on drugs, even though illegal drug use was declining at that time. But the focus on law and order turned the attention to incarcerating these people. And this was at the point in time when, in 1985, crack cocaine emerged as a drug of intense interest. And the focus on crack babies and crack addicts was accelerated. And so the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, modified in 1988, passed by Congress, differentiated between powder and crack cocaine. There is no pharmacological difference between those two forms of cocaine, none. This drug law also introduced mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes. And in the differentiation between powder and crack, the mandatory minimum sentence, typically of 5 years for possession of a drug, was applied if you were found in possession of 5 grams of crack. In order to trigger the same mandatory minimum sentence, you had to have been found with 500 grams of powder cocaine. So a 100-to-1 differentiation between the two drug forms. But this was not strictly a Republican issue. And to put this in perspective, I'm going to go back to 1915, which was a notable year in race relations in the United States. It marked the release of D.W. Griffith's notorious Klan-glorifying blockbuster film, Birth of a Nation, that romanticized the role of terrorist posses in the post-Civil War South and created a sense of nostalgia for those wonderful years of white supremacy. That Thanksgiving of 1915, William J. Simmons gathered 15 men to initiate what became known as the Second Klan. They climbed to the summit of Stone Mountain just outside of Atlanta, built an altar of 16 boulders on which they placed an American flag, a copy of the Holy Bible, and an unsheathed sword. And then they raised an enormous wood cross and set it on fire. Following this Klan resurrection ceremony, the group held regular events there. In the 1920s, they began fundraising with the United Daughters of the Confederacy to erect an enormous Confederate monument on the mountain's face: Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, and Robert E. Lee. For most all of the 20th century, it held the Klan's annual Labor Day cross burning until 1991. And Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech included, quote, "Let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia." So against this backdrop, presidential candidate Bill Clinton was shaping his tough on crime campaign message. And so just before Super Tuesday of the primary campaigns, Clinton traveled with Georgia Governor Zell Miller, Senator Sam Nunn, and Congressman Ben Jones, and gave a press conference while standing in front of a phalanx of jumpsuited inmates from the local prison. And it doesn't take a great deal of investigation to determine the race of most of the men standing behind Bill Clinton and his supporters. And so the message was obvious as he delivered his tough on crime message. And indeed, during his administration, Congress passed in 1994 the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, one of the harshest laws ever enacted in United States history. It determined that children as young as 13 could be tried as adults. It created the 3 strikes you're out, life in prison without parole. More than half of the people sentenced to life in prison without parole have never committed a violent crime. This law enacted 65 new federal capital crimes, and it provided $10 billion in funding for state prisons and $11 billion in funding for state and local police forces. In 1995, Congress created the U.S. Sentencing Commission, and they asked them to take a look at that disparity between crack and powder cocaine sentences. And this bipartisan commission came back to Congress and said there was a racial bias in sentencing and this discrepancy needed to be reduced. But Congress overrode the report. And so that 100-to-1 discrepancy continued until 2010, when the Fair Sentencing Act was passed. And it reduced the disparity from 100-to-1 to 18 to 1. Now, in the midst of all of this, the opioid epidemic began to appear. States began legalizing marijuana. The opioid epidemic began to be couched as a public health problem. Imagine what would have happened if heroin abuse or cocaine abuse addiction had been classified as public health crises instead of as crimes. So lots more arrests, the incarceration rates up an order of magnitude. How did that happen? I mean, the police are busy, right? Keeping order. So who's making all of these drug arrests? Well, law enforcement incentives were built into a number of these laws. In 1982, federal cash grants were created to make the enforcement of drug laws a priority by state and local police organizations. And in 1984, a little-known event occurred that has had profound effects on policing and law enforcement and drug incarcerations in the United States. Congress expanded the federal civil asset forfeiture law. Raise your hand if you knew about that. Yeah, well, not me. Back in 1970, Congress authorized the seizure of drugs and equipment when a drug arrest was made. In 1978, they expanded that to say anyone arrested or accused of a drug arrest, their money or their securities could be seized. And in 1984, it was expanded to include real property. And in 1986, property equal to that was no longer available. And what was different about this in 1984, prior to this, if a federal civil asset forfeiture occurred, the proceeds went to the general budget fund, whether it was in states or the federal government. It became part of the general income. But in 1984, the decision was made that federal law enforcement agencies would retain all the proceeds, and those proceeds were to be used exclusively for law enforcement. It also initiated something known as an equitable sharing program that said that if there were joint investigations, the state could benefit from these federal asset forfeitures. Even though state law prohibited it, state law still said any of these assets needed to be used for the general fund. But by cooperating with the federal government, all of the proceeds were retained by law enforcement. And so by bypassing the state laws, the funds were used for law enforcement equipment, weapons, salaries and overtime, training, travel expenses, informant reward money, detention facilities. So in 1986, the total civil asset forfeiture value was $93.7 million. By 2013, that year, it was $4.2 billion. And so it resulted in cash grants being given to states based on the number of drug arrests. And between 1997 and 1999, there were 3.4 million orders of Pentagon equipment delivered to state and local law enforcement agencies. And we see the consequences of that today when there is a disturbance in a city, a protest, a fear it might get out of hand. And what we see is that the protesters are confronted by men and women armed for war. And there has been collateral damage to all of this as well. One is the assault on the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment to the Constitution reads, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. And yet today we see traffic stops where car searches are carried out. And that began with a Supreme Court decision in 1968 called Terry v. Ohio, where the court substantially expanded the police power to search and seize, limiting the rights of privacy under the Fourth Amendment. Terry expanded the notion of warrantless search to include suspicious behavior as a preventive measure. It came about because two Black men were standing in front of a jewelry store and they were arrested for suspicious behavior. And Terry v. Ohio said, okay, that makes sense. So with this decision, the Supreme Court affirmed that police officers could interrogate and frisk suspicious individuals without probable cause for an arrest. The Terry rule was used to target African Americans for sporting flat brim hats and hooded sweatshirts. And that right was expanded further in 1996 in the Supreme Court decision Wren v. United States that allows law enforcement the ability to stop a person in a motor vehicle based on a pretext and then search the vehicle with no probable cause. And so law enforcement officials stop individuals based on previous bias or profile and justified that action through various pathways like a routine traffic stop. And the reality is that could apply to any one of us, even though it has been used to target Black and Hispanic people. And so what we have seen is the racial bias in stop and frisk. The fact that these arrests and incarcerations disrupt social relationships, split families, people lose their jobs while they are in jail awaiting trial, 500,000 people at any given point in time. It has resulted in the militarization of the police and clearly the use of excessive force. Police shootings of unarmed Black men with impunity. And so it has contributed significantly to the erosion of trust in what for many police organizations claim is their mission, which is to protect and serve. And so we have seen an explosion in life sentences without parole. That rate has quadrupled since 1984. As I said, more than one half of these when not a single violent crime had been committed. And if you are sentenced to death in the United States, you are entitled to legal representation in support of an appeals process. And if you cannot afford legal representation, it will be provided to you. But if you are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and that sentence could be imposed on a child as young as 13, you are entitled to no legal support. What we're finding is that the sentences of African American men are 20 to 50 times those of white men for the same crime. And the legacy of lynching is inextricably infected with racial bias and error in the imposition of the death penalty. You may all be aware of the Innocence Project and the work of the Equal Justice Initiative and Brian Stevenson in taking people wrongfully convicted of crimes and wrongfully sentenced to death and having their sentence overturned, and they are freed in certain circumstances. This whole system is fed by probation and parole. In the state of Delaware, within 3 years, 75% of people released from jail will be reincarcerated, and 85% of the time there is no new crime. It is a violation of a term of probation, the failure to report and address change, the failure to make a probation officer meeting. The response is immediate reincarceration. And so we see that the correctional control extends far beyond the prisons and the jails. with 7 million people under the control of the full system. One of the other things that happened with the allocation of $10 billion in money for prisons is that states began building prisons to hold this exponential increase in the number of incarcerated individuals. And they used federal money to do it. But eventually, it got to be really expensive to house these prisoners, and the states found they were unable to make that work. And so a capitalist system response to the problem developed with the creation of private for-profit prisons. In 1998, there were 5. By 2008, 10 years later, there were 100. And the profits of those prisons had increased 500% during that time period. Now, for those of us who have worked for profit businesses, we know how the bottom line is calculated. Revenue less expenses equal profit. And so you have to ask yourself, if you are the warden, if you are running a for-profit prison, how much money are you going to put into rehabilitation and pre-release programs to help people be successful when they are discharged from prison, when that expenditure reduces the profit that you provide? And even more cynically, how much money and energy are you going to put into making people being released from prison successful in their return to the community, when if they are unsuccessful, they will be back and generating more income for your for-profit prison? And that's what we see. Another issue is the impact of cash bails and fines and fees. This is one of the reasons why people are still in prison awaiting trial, because they cannot make bail. Obviously, there are times for public safety that a bail that can't be met is imposed, but the vast majority of those nearly 500,000 people, that is not the case. And in the state of Delaware, if you have an unpaid fine or fee, a warrant may be issued for your arrest. And concurrent with the issuance of that warrant is that your driver's license is suspended. So you couldn't pay the fine. The fine typically starts out at $100 or less, but the fees will take a $100 fine and make it a $500 debt. And you can't pay it. And when you can't pay it, a warrant is issued for your arrest and your driver's license is suspended. So if you're driving to your job and you're stopped, then you will incur another set of fines and fees for driving without a license. So that's the nature of the system. And it is damaged in every regard. And so a few years ago, a judge in Massachusetts looked at the statistics and he said, the rate of arrest and incarceration of Black people is out of all proportion to their population in the state. Based on the 2016 data, 655 of every 100,000 Black residents of Massachusetts was in prison. And that contrasted with 82 per 100,000 of its white citizens. And so he asked Harvard University to take on a study of this and determine why these disproportionate results. And so what Harvard did is it reviewed more than 1 million cases, and it did indeed confirm the rate of incarceration for Black Massachusetts residents versus white. Black citizens make up 24% of the population of the state, but they accounted for 63% of the stops, frisks, and searches. And more of those stopped were detained without bail and their bail was set higher. For the same act, they were charged with more severe offenses, and they were more often referred to superior court, where federal sentencing took hold, as opposed to state court, where the penalties were less severe. And the average sentence for a Black prisoner was 168 days longer than a white person for the identical crime. And there was no escaping the reason why. And so when we look across the country, Massachusetts is not alone in these results. What we see across the country is a significant erosion of Fourth Amendment rights for all of us, although the impact is most often and most dramatically felt by Black and brown people in our society. And what we see is that our total criminal justice system is racialized at every stage, from beginning to end. Disproportionate numbers of Black and brown people are stopped by police. Of those who are stopped, a disproportionate number result in an arrest. A disproportionate number of people have charges filed, and those charges are more severe. The bail conditions are more difficult to meet. The availability of legal representation is less. There is more likely to be a plea bargain versus a trial. Because if you think about it, people at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, which includes white people as well as Black for sure, do not have access to paid legal representation in many cases. It has been said convincingly that it is better to be white and guilty in the United States criminal justice system than Black and poor. Your outcome is virtually guaranteed to be better. And so faced with the possibility of going to trial and having a mandatory minimum sentence imposed, people will be convinced or convince themselves to take a plea bargain to avoid trial, without, in many cases, appreciating the implications of having a record. Again, on housing, food, employment, jury service, voting. Seemed like a good deal, right? But it's not. The sentences are more severe. Appeals are less often filed, again, because of access to legal representation. And the results are often worse. And so what we know is that the criminal justice system in the United States is in desperate need of reform at every level, federal, state, and local. Action is underway. In fact, today there are not 2.3 million Americans incarcerated. It is closer to 2 million. And so actions that have been taken have rectified some of the most extreme inequities that have existed in the system. But so much more is needed. And what is important for each of us is to become aware of initiatives, legislative often, underway to make the criminal justice system more equitable and to demand action on those initiatives. The state of Delaware has one of the most, if the most, law enforcement officer Bill of Rights that protects the actions of police. That if a charge is made of inequitable treatment against a police officer, there is no requirement to report that any action was taken to investigate the claim let alone was any action taken as a consequence of illegal or inappropriate behavior. It's all secret. Police reform is desperately needed. One of the things that we know is that police officers have the same types of biases that any human being in our country might have. Yet they have the power to act on those biases in ways that fundamentally can alter someone's life. And so bias training, use of body cameras, setting use of force standards, eliminating this impunity with which police officers often can act, and having transparency around the actions of police are absolutely essential to make the system fairer and to make people develop a greater level of confidence in the role and the actions of police, who are, after all, charged to protect and serve. So this is time for you with any reactions, questions, responses, thoughts.
Through listening to all of this, it's so intertwined and so woven together that I sit and I listen to this and I think, where do you start? I realize you take baby steps in often many situations, but this is so complex.
It is, and it has existed for so long, and it is grounded in so much of our history. I teach another standalone class called Race in the Jury, and it talks about illegal blocking of racial minorities in jury service. And one of the statistics that comes out in that report is that 95% of prosecutors in the United States are white and operate with a set of beliefs and biases. And as Black people, brown people are kept from jury service, the role of a jury is twofold. We know a jury is to issue a verdict. But in the process of doing that, the jury's role is to assess the credibility of the witnesses. And if you have an all-white jury, and there may be Black and white witnesses, there are assessments made about the credibility of witnesses that can be predicated on race. I was on a jury once. I've been on several, but I was on one. And at the end of all of the testimony, as we were to reach a verdict, we did. It was a unanimous verdict. But in the course of our deliberations, we discovered that each of us knew that every single solitary witness lied. Every single one. So if you layer the lens of race over credibility of individuals, it is a complicating factor that makes the situation even more difficult. So you're right, Dick, it's all of a piece and it's all interwoven. But it does begin at some level with district attorneys and prosecutors' offices. Because one of the things that happened with these laws that were passed is that the variable, the discretion, was taken away from the judge and given to the prosecutor, who decides what to charge someone with. And so one of the initiatives that has been taking hold in certain jurisdictions are pre-sentencing diversion programs, particularly for younger people who are arrested, and diverting them away from prison, away from jail, into a program that helps with job placement, that helps with housing, that helps with the ability to be a functioning member of a community, and not immediately sending them off to prison with the consequences of what happened. So that is a very real, very effective program. Doesn't solve it, but it helps. And being aware of those and supporting them is really essential work that would make a difference.
I attend a session on Wednesday that's sponsored by the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice. And speaking to Dick's question, just in terms of prison outreach and support, this same thing came up. And the question was, what is a big problem? What can be done? And what they decided to do, I think we're in week 5 of the seven-week discussion, is to they're going to convene a group that's going to come together and try to look at prison support and prison outreach, and establishing, like-minded people that try to deal with the holistic approach in terms of going into the prisons, helping people transition once they get out of prisons, doing expungements, the whole prison ministry support. And so that should be done within the next couple of months, because they had the same issue, Vic, and that is such a big problem. And so what do we do now we understand the problem? A lot of people didn't understand the problem.
Right.
And so they said, so what, and that's sort of the solution that they came up with. They want to convene a group of people that can get together, that have different skill sets. You need lawyers, you need folks that can go into prisons, you need churches. And so within the next couple of months, we're going to try to put together something like that. And we're going to be sending out invitations to people that are like-minded, that want to get involved and be a part of the solution. So I'm not certain that if Sue, if any of you all might be interested, if so, I would send the invitation out to Sue and see if she or any other people that she might know might want to attend a session like that.
Great. That would be great, Melvin. And that's important work to be done. I took part in an exercise sponsored by the Delaware Center for Justice this past week called Visions of Justice. And one of the things that we did was a simulation of being released from prison and needing to reestablish yourself in the community. And each of us got a different personage. My name was Florence. I was fortunate. I lived with a boyfriend and his 2 children, and I had some money, and I had 3 bus tickets, and I had my birth certificate, and I had my social security card, but I didn't have my state ID, and I didn't figure out right away how to get it. And so I used up my bus tickets, and then I couldn't get to the place where I could get my state ID. And I couldn't, when I got to the bus ticket place to buy more tickets, because I did have a little money, I didn't have a bus ticket to prove that I had gotten to the bus ticket selling place. And so I ended up hanging out there. And finally, somebody with a bus ticket bought tickets and sold me 2 $1 bus tickets for $10 so that I could get to the state ID place. I had no idea where to go. I had no idea how to get there. There were 4 15-minute segments. 10 minutes into the first segment, I said, that's it. I give up. I can't do this. I can't make it work. 10 minutes into this process, because people are released from prison with nothing. No guidance, no support, maybe nowhere to live. That visceral reaction was extraordinary. And so I'll be meeting with Kim Eppheimer, the executive director of Friendship House, which has an active program doing many of the things you're describing, Melvin, which is how to provide resources and support for people who are returning to the community so that they can effectively transition. Because if they don't, They go right back to the neighborhoods they came from, and the drug dealer on the corner can give them all the money they want, and they don't have to go through this whole horrific process. I can't tell you, well, it was such an impact. And so there is real good volunteer work to be done to make a difference and to hopefully keep that 75% of people who are reincarcerated in 3 years from going back to jail.
And the other thing that shocked me was that we had a prison outreach program at my church that serviced the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area. And what I found when I came here and started looking at this, that Delaware's situation in terms of its prison situation is worse than all three of those jurisdictions.
Mm-hmm.
I was shocked to see that, and talking to some of the people that are involved, and talked about in terms of transitioning people out, talked about counseling within the prison, talked about access to computers, all the things you need to do so you won't do recidivism. That Delaware was in much worse shape than all three of those jurisdictions.
It is
which was
indeed.
shocking.
It is indeed. And the other thing is, people say, well, at least Delaware doesn't have for-profit prisons. No, we don't. But when the prisons are overcrowded, we send people 200, 300, 400 miles away to a for-profit prison in Pennsylvania. And gosh, their family can't come see them anymore because they can't get there. So, I mean, and it's all invisible, it's just all below the radar. And it doesn't take much poking to figure out what's happening and to say, what could be done about this? What could I as one person do? What could I as one church do? What could I as one group do? There is a lot that could be accomplished. But first we have to know the problem exists. So thank you for doing that, Melvin. That's great.
So I just want to make one comment about most people don't recognize that the way our system is set up, for people who have felonies, the system is set up essentially to force them back into prison. Because in addition to having difficulty getting a job, you pretty much have forfeited any access to any kind of social support.
Yep.
From the social safety net, because you're not eligible for it.
Yep.
You're prevented from getting that.
Yep.
I think most people recognize that. Also,
yeah, I think you, just as to interject, I think you joined us a little bit after the start of the program, but basically the penalties against criminals now are the same that we used to enact in laws against Black people. Access to education, employment, housing, social services, voting, all those things that you used to not be able to do because you're Black. The Civil Rights Act changed that, but these laws about felons have reinstituted all of those prohibitions. They just don't have to say the N-word.
and another thing I found out about felons when they're on probation, they've got to pay fees to meet with the probation officer. I don't know if most people knew that either.
Yep.
If you've got a person with no job, barely have a place to live, can't get food, and they still got to pay the probation officer. I think if they're not doing that like they're supposed to, that can be used against them also as a probation violation and force them back into jail again.
Yep.
Also, as you talked about the jury piece before, I finally got to watch the movie 12 Angry Men. I don't know if anybody has seen that movie or not, but if you want to get a good insight to the kind of biases that people have when they're making decisions about whether someone's guilty or not, this movie came out in the 50s. I highly recommend you watch it.
It's very powerful. I agree. I did watch it, but I watched the one scene again here recently, and I will go back and watch the whole film. Yeah. So these are things we can do something about. They are things that cry out for attention. And next week, we're going to focus on the consequences of being Black in the context of voter suppression and being able to have your voice heard, being able to serve on juries. And then our 6th class takes all this history that we've been learning and says, now that we know this, what are we going to do about it? Where do we go from here? And that's a question for each one of us individually and also for organizations and groups. with whom we associate. So we want to be respectful of our time. We've come to the end of our hour, but I want to thank you for being here. And I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sue.
all.
Thank you, Sue.
Good night.
Sorry, I was late.
Thanks, Sue.